Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to accompany you today. I know you're watching this video to relax or help you sleep. So first, please like and subscribe. Where are you from? What time is it? Relax, unwind, and enjoy the moment. The dead in this town refuse to stay buried. It started like most things tend to do around here, on a Sunday afternoon. Folks around here will tell you that's because Sunday's the day of the Lord's rest. And, well, if the Lord is resting, then he probably isn't paying too close attention. Maybe lets a few things slip through. I think the whole sentiment is silly at best and blasphemous at worst. No, I think things tend to happen on Sundays around here, simply because, on the Holy Sabbath, people just have less things going on. More time to cause mischief. Or at least sit around and concoct some imagined slight against them and them's kind. But all the same, it did start on a Sunday. I remember distinctly because church had just let out. The church ladies in their frilly pastel dresses shuffled along Main Street, pretty as pastries and loud as geese, chittering happily amongst themselves. Their husbands followed, some young and handsome in fresh suits and buckled shoes. Others older and crammed uncomfortably into their clothing, large patches of sweat visible under their arms and at the smalls of their backs. As their wives traded recipes and gossip, they talked in more muted tones, their hands at times brushing together conspiratorially. And last, their children, pockets and bustles of children, whirligig daydreams tumbling before or after or between the legs of parents. Little girls with flyaway hairs escaping their pigtails. White tights stained gray over knobbly knees and scuffs on shiny black shoes. Little boys with shirts half tucked, holes in the knees of their slacks, shoving each other in raucous play. You see, every Sunday the church-going people had a tradition of making their way from the service, down Main Street and past the storefronts with their gleaming windows and striped canopies, and to Mrs. A's home. Mrs. A was something of the town matriarch. Her family had been one of the first to found, their namesake featuring prominently on many important places in town, like the library, the tiny white elementary school, and even the quasi-annual Easter Day Basset Hound Festival, the latter of which never made much sense to me, to be frank. I would have thought that the Easter Day celebration would feature rabbits as a more prominent figure. Other folks must have thought so too, because at some point it started featuring a contest for the hound that most closely resembled a rabbit, in an apparent attempt to reconcile the two. But I digress. Mrs. A herself was just as much of an institution as those buildings and events that bore her family name. That she had in some way touched the lives of every single person living in this town could not be overstated. She had served as the elementary school's sole teacher for over 50 years, only retiring when I myself came to take her place. Since then, she had been the town's librarian. Every bake sale, festival, and charity collection was conducted under her guidance. But more than anything, Mrs. A was involved in the birth of every babe that breathed their first breath in our little patch of the world. No matter what time of day or night, no matter what the circumstances, Mrs. A was always there, her presence as immutable as the changing of the seasons. I remember when I gave birth to my own son, Jonathan. I was in my bedroom, my midwife squeezing my clammy hands between her own, as I pushed and breathed and shook. And with that final push, as my darling baby slipped into this world and began to cry, Mrs. A appeared in the doorway. "Here, let me," she offered sweetly, stretching out her arms to receive Jonathan from the midwife, who had already begun placing him on my chest. "No, that's okay, I've got him," I tried, holding my baby close to my bosom. "It's all right, babies love me. I can make them calm, help them sleep," she countered, arms still stretching towards me. "I don't think," I began, but my midwife was already picking the baby up. For a moment I started to panic, frantically reaching out to grab my baby. The midwife's hand on my arm was soft but stern as she glanced down at me, shaking her head in a soft warning. As soon as Jonathan left my arms, his screams intensified. Soon, however, Mrs. A scooped him into her embrace. She began to sing something softly under her breath, a lullaby of some sort. All at once my baby's eyelids fluttered and his crying ceased. He stared up at her, transfixed, quiet, and numb, and then his eyes closed, and he slept. "There, isn't that better?" Mrs. A whispered. She handed the baby back to me. "I make sure everyone can rest," she added, and it felt threatening. I don't know. By then, the strain of birth and haze of endorphins had already begun to take over, making memories fuzzy at the edges. So, yes, Mrs. A had been a prominent figure in the town for as far back as anyone could remember. So long, in fact, that many of the town's children were afraid of her, thinking she was some kind of witch or demon outside of time. I myself never put much stock in these things. As a teacher myself, I knew how easily children's frustrations in school or wild imaginations could take shape into wilder rumors. And after all, Mrs. A could be strange, that was certain. But she was pleasant enough. Case in point, every Sunday she hosted nearly half the town at her house for lunch after church. Once weekly, the boisterous parishioners would gather in her foyer, or yard if the weather permitted, for tea and fresh lemonade and sandwiches made with the nice white bread with the crusts cut off. Jonathan and I rarely attended these parties, though not for any scandalous reasons. I had simply always felt that the teaching of morality and religion was best suited for the privacy of the home. But for most of the rest of the town, this ritual was just as important as the good word, the gathering, as unquestioned as Mrs. A herself. So you can imagine the bolt of shock and horror that passed through the town on that Sunday afternoon, when, having missed her at church that morning, the crowd made its way to Mrs. A's house, only to find her stone cold dead. The woman that had discovered her later stated that she found Mrs. A sitting upright in her bed, a book in her lap. As best as anyone could imagine, she had fallen asleep while reading and simply passed away. The news swept through the town like a plague. While no one was especially surprised that a woman who had to be approaching, if not surpassing greatly, her 100th birthday had died, it was still a huge blow to the traditions, and more importantly, the moral fabric of the town itself. People spent several days walking around town in a daze, seemingly at a loss for how to proceed. It was so bad, in fact, that by the time some folks got around to holding a service and burying Mrs. A, an entire week had passed. That Sunday began much as the rest had, with the exception of a special memorial service honoring the legacy of Mrs. A near the second half. This gave way to the funeral service proper, which of course I attended. Jonathan, uncomfortable in his pressed black suit, clinging to my leg throughout. It was an open casket, and as I approached the body to pay respects, I noticed that someone had thought to place a book, presumably the one she had been reading when she passed, beneath her crossed hands. Fully expecting it to be a Bible, I was shocked to discover the title, large golden letters stamped into red leather, which read, "The Lord's Prayer," except it was printed backwards. "What the hell?" I murmured under my breath. Then, remembering myself, turned away from the body and took my seat along the far wall with the other, less important mourners. Jonathan buried his face in my jacket, refusing to look at the body. I ran my fingers through his golden baby locks absently. By the time they finished burying Mrs. A, it was high noon and the sun was blazing. The thick summer heat combined with the steamy moisture rising up from the cemetery lawn and freshly turned dirt created a suffocating, sickly, sweet smell that made me feel like I was drowning. I was relieved when the service completed and I could take myself and my boy home. Most of the others opted instead to return to Mrs. A's home. One last soiree before whichever of the innumerable vulturous grandchildren and favorite nieces and tolerated uncles circling the home began to pick at the carcass of the estate. It was later that evening when it happened. The sun was in the early stages of setting, sinking itself like a fat hen into the nest of the horizon. Already the soft little chirrups of crickets could be heard mingling with the errant bark of a dog or the chiming of a bicycle bell. That's when I first heard it. It was faint at first, so distant and quiet that I could have been convinced I was imagining things. With each passing second, however, it grew louder and more distinct. Singing. Not just any song, but that of the eerie lullaby that Mrs. A would use to induce deep slumber in her babies. As it came drifting through the windows, the song seemed to drag itself into my home, It grasped at the sills and hoisted itself past the threshold, crawling and creeping and unfurling like smoke into the farthest reaches of my living room. And it was a woman's voice that sung it, but it was wrong too. Like the words were there, but the essence was wrong. Like it was gasped out in asthmatic torment rather than sung. Like it pained the singer. "Mommy?" Jonathan queried, standing on his tiptoes to try to peer over the edge of the window. "Come away from the window, sweetheart," I implored, drawing him to my knees. And in the next moment, I was grateful that I did, because by then, she had come into view. Mrs. A, dressed in her funeral clothes, came marching down the street. Except marching wasn't quite the right word for it. More like she was dancing down the street, twisting and turning with a litheness that seemed impossible to imagine for her brittle little body. And as she danced, she sang that lullaby, pressed it out through gritted teeth and unmoving lips. And as she danced and sang, she tapped that book against her thigh in an endless rhythm, a metronome to keep her time. Tap, tap, tap. And she danced down the street. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. Could we have been wrong? Did we bury a living woman by mistake? But I knew that Mrs. A had been dead in her bedroom for a full week without stirring even once. And I had seen the body, corpse gray, with fingers so stiff with rigor mortis that, I realized, maybe they had buried her with the book because they couldn't remove it. And even now, as she grew closer, I could see that her eyes were half closed, one cornea a milky gray haze, and the other with a golden coin still lodged beneath the lid. Somewhere in the distance, a woman shrieked. "Mommy!" Jonathan whined, pressing his face into my knees. "It's all right, baby," I cooed, drawing the curtains closed before scooping my boy into my arms. I carried him into the basement, barring the door closed behind me. "What's happening?" Jonathan sniffled. "We're just going to play a little game," I supplied, grabbing an armful of blankets to make a nest in the far corner of the room. "A game?" "Right, a little game. We're going to pretend we're explorers. We found a big cave and we have to map it out. Do you want to help me do that?" I asked, taking the box of art supplies down from its shelf and bringing them to my son. "Yeah," he cried happily, previous terror leaving him altogether. We stayed in the basement all night. What else could I do? Or what else? The next morning, there was no noise outside of my home when I tentatively plodded my way into the living room. No children's laughter, no gossiping old ladies. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. My heart pounding in my throat, I gingerly made my way to the window and peeked outside. To my relief, not a single walking corpse to be found. Just a quiet, peaceful street on a warm spring day. Still, it took several hours before I felt confident enough to venture outside, leaving Jonathan tucked away safely in the basement, with instructions not to open the door for anyone but me. By this time, a small gathering of people had formed, standing just outside the threshold of Mrs. A's garden. As I approached, it was to the sound of loud, angry voices undercut by scattered sobs. The group looked haunted, most of them with deep circles under their eyes, as if they too hadn't slept at all last night. "But what was it?" a woman was screaming. Abigail, I realized, a young mother from down the road. "How the hell am I supposed to answer that?" "John," the town sheriff replied. His hat was in his hands. As he spoke, he wrung the edge between white knuckles. "Well, aren't you supposed to be the law? Surely you can do something." Another woman in the crowd started, but John cut her off. "Ain't know nothing about no demons. What do you want me to do? Arrest the body?" "Oh my God, this can't be happening," someone moaned, fanning her face as her husband propped her up with a single arm across the back. "But it was Mrs. A, right? We're all in agreement that it was her?" a man asked. "Hey, listen, Mrs. A was an angel of a woman. I won't have you slandering her name like that," replied a thin young man in a dirty tan suit. "Oh, you would say that, wouldn't you, Thomas? We all know you were her great-grandnephew. Saw you scratching around her back door in the past few years myself. Begging like an old dog for scraps," an old woman retorted. "Come now, Thomas, nobody is trying to taint your family's name. Folks are simply saying that what they saw, well, it looked quite a bit like your aunt," John pressed. Thomas looked like he had swallowed a toad. "It was her, all right. I watched her. made it all the way to the end of the street and turned right at the butcher shop. My cousin on the other side of town says he saw her around midnight. She was headed back over the hill towards the cemetery, someone else added fervently. She was dancing with the devil, she was! Someone from the back of the crowd screamed. The swell of the crowd's voices rose up at that, reaching a crescendo of panic. So what? She just made a big circle? I asked. The crowd quieted. Several people turned to face me, including John, apparently noticing me there for the first time. I'm guessing, John said, still doing his best to rip his hat in two. What does it want? A woman whispered darkly. Chatter broke out throughout the crowd once more. It wants something. What if it's coming after us? Wants our children? A woman cried, nearly hysterical. I think we should fight it, a large burly man with curly black hair shouted. Fight it? What the hell would we use to fight that thing? Ain't nothing living that a gun can't shoot dead, an old man supplied, rubbing his chin wisely. But it ain't alive, though, is it? Someone asked. A hush over the crowd again. I think Pastor Stevens should fight it, use the scripture against it. Abigail again. Pastor Stevens looked pale. Well, I don't know. I haven't exactly encountered... Yeah, Father. Read from the good book and ask God to smite it. Send it back to hell. A man yellowed, and the crowd cheered. Now what, just a damn minute, Thomas argued. This is Mrs. A we're talking about. Regardless of whatever has happened to her, I'm sure she wouldn't hurt us. And she ain't no demon. The crowd looked skeptical. Look, we know one thing, and that's that, whatever it was, I began, and Thomas shot me a pointed look. It went away, back to the cemetery, hopefully for good. The crowd exchanged worried glances, some appearing placated by this statement, while others were clearly dubious. Right, so I'm thinking, John began, we go to the cemetery. See if everything's, where it's supposed to be. Several young men nodded in agreement, and John began to smile. And if it is? Someone asked. John's mounting triumph dissipated all at once. Pardon? If it is that way, if everything is back to its place, then what do we do? To keep it there? Abel, a young man that I know had graduated from school 2 years ago, stepped forward. I say, he began, glancing around conspiratorially, that we push a big rock on top of the grave, keep her in. The crowd chittered with approving noises. I couldn't help but think to myself how wonderful it must be to live the kind of life that would compel me to respond to hell's mockery and heaven's indifference with, push a big old rock on it. John must have caught something in my expression because he rounded on me. You have a better idea? He demanded, drawing glances from the rest of the crowd. I was under no illusion that I was still largely viewed as an outsider in this town. Most of the families in these parts had lived here for generations. I myself had only moved here around 3 years ago, seeking a job opportunity and a fresh start. After losing my Henry, it had felt like the only thing to do. I don't, I offered, bowing my head slightly. This seemed to placate John, as well as the crowd, for they slowly turned away. It did no good at a time like this to add fuel to the fire of their suspicions that I, as an outsider, and someone more book-learned, thought I was better than them. Besides, I had no goddamn idea what to do in this situation. Who's to say that a rock wouldn't do the trick? And so, a handful of menfolk set off towards the cemetery, John leading them. The rest of the crowd dissipated in gentle waves, and I myself returned home to free my son from the basement. When John and the others returned by the end of the day, they were covered in sweat and dirt and smiling triumphantly, truly the picture of men returning from some great war. According to them, the grave had been dug up, the soil heaped up in 2 mounds on either side. The coffin lid lay splintered into pieces 20 or so feet away. Mrs. A herself, however, lay peacefully dreaming. 100% definitely dead, they confirmed. The menfolk didn't bother with a new lid, simply pushed the dirt back into the grave, a fact which horrified Pastor Stevens and several of the congregation alike, before pushing a large boulder they had towed from a nearby farm on top of it. And just like that, problem solved. The crowd cheered, quickly siphoning off to a nearby parlor to buy the glorious heroes a drink. Look, if people slept a little better that night, all power to them. Even after everything that happened, I would never wish to take that fleeting moment of ignorant serenity from them. I just know that for my own part, I had trouble relaxing at all for the next 3 days. By the fourth, I had started to grow slightly less on edge. By the seventh, I was cautiously optimistic. But would you be surprised, in the way that none of us should have been surprised, that on that seventh day on Sunday, just as the sun began to set, that Mrs. A returned? Jonathan and I were sitting across from each other at the dining room table. We had been steadily working on a puzzle together for the past hour, but in truth I felt that neither of our hearts were in it. Mostly we just listlessly shuffled the pieces around in between taking bites of the peanut butter sandwiches I had made for supper. It was all I had the energy to make these days. Like I said, I hadn't been sleeping very well. I think some of my paranoia must have seeped into Jonathan as well, because even though he had never laid eyes on that terrible monstrosity, his sleep also seemed fretful. We had finally completed the monotone chunk of sky that had been plaguing us for the past 30 minutes when I first heard it. That sickening melody, seeping in through the seams of the windows, I had been tightly latching the past few days. If Jonathan had noticed my increased measures at home security recently, he didn't mention it. Didn't even seem upset when I wouldn't let him play in the yard anymore, bless him. The first few vague tones of that lullaby, indistinct in nature but unmistakable to me now, sent a chill up my spine. All at once my body seized up almost painfully, my fingers gripping the serrated edge of a puzzle piece hard enough to warp the happy visage of the smiling sun it depicted. "Is that—" Jonathan began. He too seemed frozen in place. I watched as my son sat, eyes wide and ears perked up towards the window, beautiful and precious in his rabbit heart terror. "Yes," I answered simply, because there was no use pretending. Jonathan was young, but he was a smart boy, and he could see the way my fear gripped me, and he could sense the desperation in the way I ran to the window, and he knew in the way that all children knew when their parents first revealed the sensitive underbelly of their own vulnerability, that we were complete and utterly damned. "Is she dreaming?" Jonathan whispered. "What? Is Mrs. A dreaming? Sarah says that her brother sometimes walks around when he's dreaming." I paused, considering my options. "No, baby, I don't think she is," I admitted. I turned to face the window at last. Mrs. A was there, relentless in her unholy waltz, making her way down the street with enthusiasm, as if to mock us, as if to laugh at how easily one dead little old lady, could utterly undo us. One of her eyes still contained its purloined treasure, but I noticed that her clothes were now caked in mud. Roots and stones clung in the rat's nest of her gray hair, which already had begun to fall out in thick clumps, exposing a bloodless, leathery scalp beneath. The flesh of her face had begun to dry and contract around her skull, making her clenched tooth grin now lipless. And perhaps worst of all, her fingers had been worn down to stumps, ribbons of dry flesh dangling from them like streamers for her cryptic jig. She clawed her way out. I nearly vomited at the sight of her. It took everything in me to close the curtains, and I swear that just before they closed, I could see her turn her face to wink at me through the window. The sound of her sickening tune grew louder as she passed our home, and I realized then that nothing else could be heard outside. No baying dogs or yowling cats. Even the crickets had paused their nightly sonata. I didn't bother hiding with my son in the basement that night. It seemed like Mrs. A's aim was to make a giant circle around the town, spreading her torment as far as she could. Besides, I figured, there's not much I could do if she did try to get in. Instead, I just picked my little boy up in my arms, took him to my bed, and spent another sleepless night under the veil of the echoes of Mrs. A's devil song. I'll spare you the tedious details of the many conversations, fights, and hysterics that occurred over the next few days. Amongst the town, clear divisions were drawn based on how folks thought best to deal with this problem. A number of men, principal amongst them John, were in favor of violent confrontation. The exact nature of this confrontation had yet to be determined, but invariably the methods suggested were brutish, crude, and probably messy. Others thought it was best to put our fate in the hands of the Lord. Some suggested gathering together to pray continuously until next Sunday. presenting a united front through our dedication to the faith to perhaps gain some divine intervention. Others wanted Pastor Stevens to try to exorcise the demons from Mrs. A. At some point, a kind of hybrid faction formed between the menfolk and the womenfolk, and it was suggested that Pastor Stevens fist fight the corpse. This idea quickly lost momentum, however, when Pastor Stevens threw up on his own shoes at the mere suggestion. At last, it was suggested that we attempt to trap her somehow, non-violently of course, though the inevitable next steps, where exactly do we store a living corpse, had so far not been determined. So turbulent was the disagreement and infighting that no conclusion had been reached by next Sunday, and, as expected, Mrs. A began her weekly march down the streets right as the sun began to descend into the inky arms of the mountains. She was nearly halfway down Main Street, not far from my house, when it happened. Thomas, shaking like a leaf and with tears in his eyes, ran into the street to impede her path. "Auntie," redacted, he started, voice tremulous. "Thomas," I cried, daring to open my window by several inches. "Get away from there! Run away!" I could see the faces of my neighbors pressed up against their windows, could read the terror in their eyes, and see the way their lips moved in silent supplication to the boy who stood mere feet from that horrid creature. Mrs. A paused her dance, and for the first time seemed to direct her gaze with true purpose, peering up her hooked nose at the lanky young man, who somehow looked small despite towering above her. "I know you wouldn't hurt us, Auntie. Please tell me what you want," he whimpered. Mrs. A opened her clenched jaw, and the task seemed to pain her, like it took every ounce of strength left in that withered old body to accomplish. She began to sing again, and the tune was the same, but the key had changed, high-pitched and grating. Thomas clamped his hands over his ears against it. "Please, Auntie, I don't—" But that's as far as he made it. In a flash, Mrs. A had shuffled forward, her bastardized ballerina step drawing her close enough to grasp the boy by his throat. Effortlessly, she lifted him from the ground, and in one swift motion, snapped his neck. The sound reverberated cruelly in the still, calm night air, the timing of it coinciding with the next metronome tap of her book. All at once she ceased her infernal tapping, instead dragging the boy forward with each step and shaking him so that the mangled bones of his neck crunched in time to the beat. She continued her march, seemingly unfazed, carrying her ghoulish maraca with her until I lost sight of her at the bend in the road. By next Sunday, she had gone back to the tapping, though the rattling still accompanied her. Thomas had joined her dance. Some people packed up and left not long after. It may surprise you, however, that the vast majority of people stayed behind. For most folks around here, this was the only home they had ever known. The thought of up and leaving, as bad as the situation may be, was unfathomable. For others, including myself, we simply had no means of doing so even if we wanted to. I had used up nearly all of my meager savings from Henry's passing on, moving us here. If we were to leave now, it would be to a life of starvation on the streets elsewhere. Believe it or not, despite the horror of the situation, life actually started to settle into a new normal in the coming weeks. It became apparent to most people that there was a certain set of rules, and when things present with a pattern, humans have a tendency to place faith in that pattern, taking it for granted that consistency equates to unalienable truth. They carve out their lives in deep divots around those truths. And so, we mapped out those points, those stones in the sand, and lived our lives like rivulets of water flowing past them. The first point should be obvious. Mrs. A appeared at sunset on Sunday evenings. If people cowered and hid in their houses 24/7 in the beginning, before long they seemed comfortable to go about their business on most days of the week. Sundays, from late afternoon to early evening, it was a ghost town. We lived our lives behind tightly shuttered windows, barred doors, and faith in the good Lord to keep her moving past our doorstep. The second was discovered by our dear Thomas. Any attempt at intervention, malicious or not, would be met with swift and passionless death. Either wisdom or cowardice prevented anyone from repeating his mistake. Third, and perhaps most surprising, whatever was possessing Mrs. A, and now Thomas, was not limited to mere human corpses. No, it seemed like anything that died within the threshold of the town was reanimated. Before long, a parade of mangled creatures accompanied them in their grotesque march. Rats and mice, their necks visibly snapped, deers with half-mangled torsos or visible buckshot wounds, rabbits and foxes, and even the odd dog or cat, all following in a not-so-graceful two-step in time to the grisly beat. Some of the more devout took this as a particularly bad sign, depending on the specific flavor of their belief regarding animals and souls. I myself was more concerned with how loud the procession had become. The cacophony of feet and now hooves, paws, snorts, and bones, nearly deafening despite the steady undertone of that damn lullaby. And the fourth? Well, the fourth was probably the worst of all. It seemed that the insomnia which had begun to plague me since the beginning of this affair wasn't, as I had initially assumed, solely due to fear. As the days turned into weeks staggered into months, it became clear that something far more insidious was happening. Nobody, it seemed, was able to sleep. It grew worse with every passing day. We went from eking out a few precious hours of sleep to napping in fits of 20 to 30 minutes, to soon not sleeping at all. It was, predictably, taking a toll. Children abandoned rambunctious play, instead going through half-hearted motions, their games at times looking as if they were occurring in slow motion. Jonathan, for his part, now spent most of the day laying in his bed, his perpetual half-drowsing making tangible all manner of nightmare illusions in the waking hours. The adults fared no better. Businesses shuttered their windows. Restaurants, grocers, and butcher shops lay barren. All social activities were relegated to small gatherings in individual homes. But, as the days stretched by, even conversations amongst family members seemed to dwindle. Church services held on the longest. But in time, the crowds grew so anemic that Pastor Stevens was forced to admit defeat. Rumor around town was that he spent all day locked in his office, praying to the Lord to lift the curse that circled like a vulture over the remnants of his once happy reality. It did not come as a great shock to me when someone inevitably snapped. John had suffered with a fire burning in his belly for weeks. The kindling fueling that fire was equal parts wrapped up in his identity as a protector of this town, and the overwhelming realization that he was utterly useless in that role now. His sense of powerlessness in the face of something he could neither understand nor hope to combat drove him to a fever pitch of madness. On a chilly Sunday morning, sometime in early winter, John and a handful of other men decided they had just about had enough. They weren't going to let some old crone, and a handful of other choice words that I don't dare repeat here, kill us all. They left just after dawn, rifles and axes, and even a few choicely knobbly sticks in hand. They slipped over the horizon, headed towards the old cemetery in complete silence. Most of the birds had died weeks ago. A handful of people, mostly wives and daughters, gathered in the streets to see them off. Fatigue like they had never known rested heavily on their shoulders, and some swayed on their feet where they stood. I watched in solemn silence from my front window, one hand resting on my son's brow in my lap. He lay sleepless still, staring up at me in a haze. Lately I had to beg him to eat or drink, and when he gave in, he took meager sips with no enthusiasm. It had been days since I heard him speak, and so I sent out a silent, simple prayer to those men, hoping with everything in me that they would find success. That evening saw a dozen more performers for her damned parade. Jonathan died 3 days later. I didn't bother burying him. You can call me a monster if you wish. What kind of a mother doesn't bury her own son? But I didn't have the heart to sink him in that soil, that same earth that spawned those damn things. And in truth, I no longer thought I had the physical strength to lift the shovel. Instead, I simply wrapped him in his favorite blanket and laid his tiny body upon the dining room table. The next 4 days passed in a haze. Time had lost all meaning. I was no longer aware at any given time whether or not I was dreaming. At times I could hear faint wailing echoing across town, but I couldn't place the voices. A gunshot once. I smelled smoke at one point, but I could have been imagining it. When Sunday came, I sat on the floor with my back propped up against the back of the couch. staring at the outline of my baby's body stretched out under the glaring white light of the dining room. No sooner had the first few notes of that insipid song floated into the room that I saw his arm twitch. In a matter of seconds, he had fully sat up, the blanket slipping off him to pool in his lap. His head turned slowly, and damn it if the last desperate part of me that was still hanging on to hope didn't pray for something, anything that would signal recognition. His eyes, hazed with death, were impassive as he looked through me, and then he slipped from the table, his limbs twisting immediately into a madman's jig before throwing his full weight through the window. There, isn't that better? I wept. There isn't much left now. Those of us who chose to remain behind are too weak to escape. Besides that, the endless procession of that jambling parade of rot and muck has worn a thick rut around the perimeter of the town. Each week it grows deeper, cutting us off from the rest of the world. I wonder how long they can last. In time, will the remnants of this place be nothing but a ghost town in the middle of a towering island? Will the edges and corners forever suffer under the echoes of that phantom song? Will their bodies break down at some point? Or will their bones continue to march until the very end? Until even those are ground down into dust? I can't answer those questions. All I can do is pray and wait for death to take me. I think it will happen soon. Even now, I can hear that song on the horizon. And after all, she will make sure that I rest. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Relax, unwind, and get some sleep. See you in the next video.